We're gonna kick off today with Los Desaparecidos, or the Disappeared, also termed the Dirty War, and lasting from 1976 to 1983. This was a 7-year campaign by the Argentine government against suspected dissidents and subversives. In September of 1973, Chile's then president, Salvador Allende, was overthrown in a coup assisted by the US government, and General Augusto Pinochet took control. Now, he was a violent leader who wanted to instill fear in anyone who opposed him. Journalists, politicians, celebrities, anybody who was like, I don't like that guy, well, they kind of just disappeared. Some of them were later found dead in alleyways or ditches throughout Santiago, the capital, while others were just never found. This crazy leader frequently used the National Stadium as a secret detention center where he rounded up those who opposed him and flayed or killed them. Around 40,000 people were punished and tormented during his 17-year regime, and at least 3,200 were killed or disappeared. Now, the disappearances have left a deep scar in Argentine society for decades, in particular on those who had a relative taken away by the security forces. The pattern was similar for those arrested. Many folks were just taken from their home in the middle of the night, tormented at these detention centers, and then disposed of. Even pregnant women were arrested during this period. They were kept in prison until their offspring was born, and then the mothers were killed, and their descendants were illegally adopted by military families. The Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo is a human rights organization that was founded in 1977 to locate those kidnapped during the repression and to return them to their surviving biological families. The work of the Grandmothers has led to the location of more than 10% of the estimated 500 that were kidnapped or born in detention during this era and then illegally adopted, but that still leaves way too many families disrupted beyond repair, which honestly breaks my heart. It doesn't get any better, folks. It's time to talk about the 1871 Chinese massacre in Los Angeles. On October 24th, a mob of 500 men raided Chinatown in LA, killing at least 20 Chinese Americans and stealing an estimated $1.5 million worth of property. The killings were in response to a weapons firing event that had taken place the same day that had killed police officer Robert Thompson. The event caused a commotion, and people began shouting that the Chinese were killing white people. So chaos ensued. I think 19 immigrants were confirmed to be dead, 15 of whom were rope necklaced by the mob in the course of the riot. At least one was mutilated when the member of the mob cut off a finger to obtain the victim's diamond ring, and those killed represented over 10% of the small Chinese population of LA at the time, which numbered 172 prior to the massacre. 10 men of the mob were prosecuted, and 8 were indeed convicted of manslaughter in these deaths. The convictions were overturned, though, on appeal due to technicalities. A few 21st century sources have described this as the largest mass extinction event in American history. It was the start of a decade of violence against Asian American communities in the US and led to the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers. The effects of that day were felt for a very long time. Here's another historical doozy, and that's the start of the Tuskegee syphilis study in 1932. Black men in Macon County, Alabama, volunteered to undergo special treatment for bad human redness. They had seen signs in their neighborhood claiming that the government and county health department was going to treat them. What they didn't know was that they were actually signing up to be part of the study of untreated syphilis amongst black men. The purpose of the study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated, though by the end of the study, medical advancements meant it was entirely treatable, and the men weren't informed of the nature of the experiment, so more than 100 died as a result. There were, I think, 399 men who were diagnosed with syphilis, and they were made to believe that they were going to receive treatment for any symptoms of their bad redness. Doctors in the area were told not to treat those in the study, but just examine them to observe their symptoms. Now, I think the guys were initially told that the experiment was only going to be 6 months, but it was extended to 40 years. After funding for treatment was lost, the study was continued without informing the men that they were never going to be treated. None of the infected men were treated with penicillin, despite the fact that by 1947, that was pretty widely available and was the standard treatment for syphilis. But the study continued on, under numerous public health service supervisors, until 1972, when a leak to the press resulted in termination. I think it was on November 16th of that year, when they were like, game over, pal. Its revelation led to the 1979 Belmont Report and the establishment of the Office for Human Research Protections, and federal laws and regulations requiring institutional review boards for the protection of human subjects and studies. The OHRP for short manages this responsibility within the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Now, it wasn't until May 16th of 1997 when President at the time, Bill Clinton, formally apologized on behalf of the United States to victims of the study, calling it shameful and racist. Took people in power long enough. Like, that was only 27 years ago. Here we go again with the Armenian Genocide of 1915. Like many similar events throughout history, this one started because of religious disputes. Armenia became part of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century and was primarily a Christian country, which displeased the leaders and resulted in the mistreatment of Christian Armenians, who were often taxed more heavily and given fewer rights. When Armenians began to protest, Turkish military officials began killing hundreds of thousands of Armenian people. The massacres began in 1896, but it was in 1914, after the Turks entered World War I on the side of the Germans, that the mass genocide began. Spearheaded by the ruling committee of Union and Progress, or CUP for short, it was implemented primarily through the mass killing of around 1 million Armenians during death marches to the Syrian desert and the forced Islamization of others. Military leaders felt that Armenians were traitors, and on April 24th of 1915, they executed hundreds of leaders, which only led to more violence against the Armenian people, which continued until 1922. It's been just over 100 years since this ended. That's not long at all. Alright, how about we talk about the dark year next? So in 536 AD, parts of the world experienced darkened skies, colder weather, and crop failures. During what is considered to be the worst year to have been alive, a volcano or multiple volcanoes erupted, expelling their ash across the northern hemisphere. There isn't a firm consensus as to which volcano it was, with possible candidates in Iceland, North America, but Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia all experienced a volcanic winter, setting off the coldest decade of the last 2,300 years. Now, this resulted in what is known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. While this volcanic eruption wreaked havoc, as it was, it also helped contribute to the destructiveness of the plague of Justinian. This dark era saw summer temperatures so low that it snowed across China in August. Crops failed, people starved, so obviously during this time a lot of people died. The European population declined, and possibly by as much as a third. That's a lot. Back to icky human stuff we go, specifically human experimentation by Japanese Unit 731 during the mass extinction events of the 30s and 40s, committed primarily against innocent Chinese civilians. Nothing I've ever heard of in my life, including in fiction, is darker than the horrors committed for years by this unit, which was a military, biological, and chemical weapons research division of the Japanese Imperial Military. Now, there's not enough time today to list the half of it. I'd be here for way too long. But here's a taste. Dissections of living, new humans, fresh humans, pregnant women, without anesthesia, usually after they had been deliberately exposed and left to suffer from horrible diseases, chemical and biological weapons, and more. Oh, you want to know other ones? Okay, well, freezing limbs off of victims, horror movie style sadistic surgeries involving cutting off limbs and attaching them to the wrong sides of a victim, or removing organs and connecting the tubes back together without the organs to see what would happen. If you want an example, because I guess you do, let's see, running the esophagus straight to the intestines with no stomach in between, just to see what was gonna happen. Not to mention that the victims were routinely tormented for the fun of it, without even the flimsy excuse of science being conducted. This makes Mengele look like a misunderstood humanitarian. At least his horrors had a point. I'm not condoning them. And we're talking about thousands upon thousands of victims here. Usually innocent Chinese civilians, political prisoners, POWs, and the homeless, over the course of years in huge facilities with thousands of staff committing these atrocities. The icing on the cake? General MacArthur and the rest of the US government found out about it when they captured Japan, and they granted Unit 731 immunity for their war crimes, so long as they shared their findings with America and only America. Yeah, many of the former Unit 731 members went on to have very successful and profitable futures in Japan after the war, which, I'm sorry, that disgusts me. Here's something that I'd never heard about before today: human zoos. Sure, I knew about sideshow and freak show history, and it's kind of exploitative as it is, and it wasn't great, but that's only the tip of the damn iceberg. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Western world was desperate to see the savage, primitive people described by explorers and adventurers scouting out new lands for colonial exploitation. To feed the frenzy, thousands of indigenous individuals from Africa, Asia, and the Americas were brought to the United States and Europe, often under dubious circumstances, to be put on display in a quasi-captive life in human zoos. So I was looking through pictures of the exhibits, for lack of a better word, and one that really stood out to me was the Filipino zoo girl. She was on display in the Coney Island Zoo in 1914, and this exhibit was known as the World in Miniature and was located in Luna Park. This young girl was bound by ropes and people tossed peanuts at her, just for fun. I don't know, it might just be me, but I find it heartbreaking to see something like that happen, especially to somebody so young. Many people have no idea these zoos existed, but they're definitely a dark part of history. And what's crazy is that there are still some that have popped up in the 21st century. I don't think they're as cool as they used to be, but like this still exists. Oh, here's something Canada tries to pretend never happened. Residential schools. These were government-sponsored religious schools that were established to forcibly assimilate Indigenous youths into Euro-Canadian culture. However, the schools disrupted lives in communities, causing long-term problems amongst Indigenous peoples. An estimated 6,000 students died at the damn schools because they were isolated, their culture was scorned, made fun of, they were removed from their homes and parents, and were often separated from their siblings because the schools were segregated according to gender. In most cases, they were forbidden to speak their first language. They couldn't even write it in letters home to their parents. Now, all attempts to assimilate children began the moment they arrived. If you were a guy, your hair was chopped. You were stripped of your traditional clothes, you were given new uniforms, and new names, because Christian missionary staff spent a lot of time and attention on Christian practices, and criticized or made fun of and dismissed Indigenous spiritual traditions. By the way, the last residential school closed only in 1996, which was only a year before I was born. Since then, former students have demanded recognition and restitution, resulting in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement in 2007 and a formal apology by Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2008. In total, an estimated 150,000 First Nation young folks attended residential schools, which is far too many lives harmed. Here's a lesser-known story from history, the Great Molasses Flood. So in 1919, a peculiar disaster struck the streets of Boston. A massive wave of molasses. A large storage tank filled with 2.3 million US gallons of molasses burst, and the resulting wave rushed through the streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour, killing 21 people and injuring 150. The event entered local folklore, and residents reported for decades afterwards, and I think to this day, that when it's really warm out, they still smell molasses. Look, I like bacon with the stuff, but not that much. And we're ending today with the tsunami explosive event. So during the mass extinction event I'm not supposed to talk about, scientists in New Zealand devised a secret plan to create a tsunami device capable of flooding coastal cities and incapacitating enemies. The project commenced after US Navy officer E.A. Gibson noticed small waves generated by explosions used to clear coral reefs. So the idea was developed by the United States and New Zealand military in a program code named Project SEAL. The weapons concept was deemed feasible, but the weapons themselves were never fully developed or used, whereas a related concept, the bouncing device, was developed and used in the Yahtzee years, to be dropped into water as a means to destroy German dams and cause loss of industrial capacity and widespread flooding. So sure, while the thing technically never got made, the research from this project led to devastating explosives that we know today.
Number 10. The Burning. Most famously known for his destruction of the Shenandoah Valley in 1864, it was also called as the Burning by its residents. The Union General of the American Civil War, General Philip, was given orders that had 3 objectives: disable the valley's use as an avenue for invasion, destroy the Confederacy breadbasket, and break the Southern will to flight. There he began destroying the lower valley. This was all permitted by Lieutenant General Grant and President Lincoln to take or destroy civilian property deemed useful to the Confederate war effort. They wanted not only to destroy the supplies, livestock, and food meant for the Confederate armies, but to erode the Southern people's support. A quote made by Sheridan had said, "Death is popularly considered the maximum of punishment in war, but it is not. Reduction to poverty brings prayers for peace, and more surely and more quickly than does the destruction of human life." Despite the terror and 13 days of destruction, it was intended strategy that it would help the Union to win, and although he did help the North win against the South, this was the same man who once said, "A only good Indian is a dead Indian," to the indigenous leader Comanche Chief Tokaway. Number 9. P.T. Barnum. P.T. was a smart businessman, and he knew how to get people into his nutty ideas since he was the founder of the Barnum and Bailey Circus, aka Ringling Brothers, where as a showman he displayed amazing things like wild tigers, bears, clowns, stunt performers, and kidnapped people to be displayed as human zoos. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, he did. He would kidnap people and traffic them for his shows. Indigenous people from the Congo, Inuits, Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, just as any non-white person would live normally in their country, would be forced to travel and also getting risk of getting sick. He would display Eskimo children from Siberia and charge adults 25 cents and 10 cents for children to watch them, as they would be a novelty, wonderful treat to see. He'd call them savages in their natural state and would put Congolese people in cages with monkeys. And since this was after the time of the Civil War where African Americans were established the right to vote, a Reverend James H. Gordon once said, "Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings and with souls," and he was right. It wasn't until 1958 did these unnecessary human zoos finally closed. Number 8. The Great Chicago Fire. The Great Chicago Fire was a devastating devastating conflagration that occurred in Chicago, Illinois in October 1871. It remains one of the most infamous and destructive fires in American history. The fire started on the evening of October 8, 1871 and raged for 2 days, finally being brought under control on October 10th. The fire's exact origin remains uncertain, but it is widely believed to have started in or near a small barn on the west side of the city, where the O'Leary family had once lived. Due to dry conditions, strong winds, and the largely wooden construction of the city, the fire spread rapidly, engulfing entire blocks within minutes. The fire consumed approximately 3.3 square miles of the city, leaving over 17,000 buildings in ruins. It is estimated that about 300 people lost their lives, although the exact number is still uncertain. The Great Chicago Fire left an estimated 100,000 residents homeless and caused a widespread devastation. It was one of the most significant urban disasters in American history, and the Chicago Fire prompted cities across the United States to reevaluate and strengthen their fire prevention measures, including the implementation of stricter building codes and improved firefighting capabilities. Number 7. Panic of 1873. Also known as the Long Depression, was a severe economic crisis that began in the United States and quickly spread to other parts of the world. The Panic of 1873 was triggered by a series of events including speculative investments in railroads, overproductions of goods, and financial mismanagement. The J. Cook & Company, prominent banking firm heavily invested in the railroad industry, declared bankruptcy on September 18, 1873, and this event served as a catalyst for the financial panic. The Panic of 1873 had significant international repercussions affecting economies in Europe and other parts of the world. It became known as the Long Depression due to its extended duration. The Panic of 1873 had lasting impact on economic thought, on policy making, and it served as a backdrop to debates over monetary policies, regulations, and the role of government in economic affairs. Number 6. Labor union rise. During the Gilded Era, where roughly spanned from the 1870s to the early 1900s, the rise of labor unions played a crucial role in advocating for workers' rights and improving working conditions. As we know, there are many strikes that's been happening right now. Many workers face long hours, low wages, unsafe working conditions, and limited job security. In response to these challenges, workers began organizing themselves into labor unions. The NLU, or National Labor Union, was founded in 1866 and was one of the earliest national labor organizations in the United States. It sought to improve conditions for workers through collective bargaining and lobbying for labor reforms. The Knights of Labor was founded in 1869, and it was one of the largest and most influential labor organizations of the Gilded Age. It advocated for a wide range of reforms, including 8-hour workday, equal pay for equal work, and an end to child labor. Labor unions engaged in strikes and other labor actions to press for their demands, and the rise of labor unions during the Gilded Age laid the foundation for future labor movements and contributed to the establishment of important labor rights and protections in the United States. Number 5. Railroad strikes. Railroad strikes was a significant labor dispute that occurred during the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States. These strikes often centered around issues such as wages, working conditions, and labor rights within the railroad industry. In the Railroad Strike of 1877, it was one of the major labor strikes in the United States. It began in Martinsburg, West Virginia, in response to wage cuts for railroad workers, and the strike quickly spread across the country, involving tens of thousands of workers, leading to violent clashes with authorities. Federal troops were eventually called in to suppress the strikes, and after the strike of 1877, other strikes occurred, just like the Pullman Strike, Anthracite Coal Strike, Western Federations of Miners, and so many others. These strikes were pivotal movements in American labor history and had far-reaching consequences for the labor movement, worker rights, and the relationship between labor and management. They highlighted the struggles of workers in an era of rapid industrialization and economic change, and they played a role in shaping labor laws and regulations in the United States. Number 4. Ring ring. If you're watching this video off your phone, some of you might know that when it comes to technology, it didn't always have a screen that was accessible in your pocket, but a giant box with a handle and a speaker on each end. In this era was the creation of the one and only phone. He was best known for inventing the telephone, which has revolutionized communications and earned him a place in history as one of the most influential inventors of the 19th century, aka Alexander Graham Bell. On March 10, 1876, Bell spoke the first word transmitted by his telephone to his assistant Thomas Watson: "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." This marked a monumental achievement in communication technology. Number 3. Tam Manny Hall. Tam Manny Hall was a powerful political organization in New York City that played a significant role in the city's politics for much of the 19th and early 20th century. It was formerly known as Tam Manny Society and was originally founded as a social club in the late 18th century. However, it evolved into a political machine that exerted substantial influence over the city's political landscape. Tam Manny Hall became the dominant political force in New York City, effectively controlling city government and influencing state politics. But also, Tam Manny Hall was notorious for political corruption, with instances of embezzlement, bribery, and fraud. Boss Tweed in particular became a symbol of this corruption, and by the early 20th century, Tam Manny Hall's power began to wane due to various factors including internal divisions and the emergence of reform-minded politicians. The organization officially disbanded in 1960s, and the term Tam Manny Hall has become synonymous with the urban political machines and political corruption. It also been featured in literature, films, and other forms of popular culture as a form of political manipulation. Number 2, the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a significant piece of legislation in American history. Enacted in 1882, it was the first federal law to explicitly restrict immigration based on nationality or ethnicity. Which ironically, in 1870, they did have a 15th Amendment to the US Constitution guaranteeing the rights to vote regardless of race, color, or previous conditions or servitude. But not really. On May 6 of 1882, the Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring Chinese immigrants for 10 years. The primary purpose of this act was to severely restrict Chinese immigrants to the United States, particularly Chinese laborers. It was fueled by the anti-Chinese sentiment, which was widespread in the late 19th century, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was renewed and extended several times, becoming a very permanent policy. It was not fully repealed until the Magnuson Act of 1943, which allowed a limited number of Chinese immigrants. The Chinese Exclusion Act is considered one of the most discriminatory immigration policies in US history, as it contributed to a legacy of anti-Chinese sentiment and xenophobia, and it had lasted effects on the Chinese American community. In 2012, both houses of Congress passed resolutions expressing regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act and acknowledging its harmful impact on Chinese Americans and the nation as a whole. But of course, the US has a lot more reparations for the many people they tormented. It was a lot of groups of people, and still a lot of people, even right now as we speak. Number 1, lynching left and right. Of course, we're going to talk about this era. You know, I will eventually talk about these issues that ricocheted into the attitudes that built our society into its current struggles. Between 1882 and 1899, over 2,500 black men and women were lynched, and almost half of them between 1889 and 1899. Of the victims, 2% were women, and accusations of physical harm on a white woman, and occasionally acts of the killings were usually excuses for lynching, along with a host of lesser allegations. The largest lynching in US history were in 1891 New Orleans lynchings, the death of 11 Italian American and Italian immigrants in New Orleans by a mob for their alleged role in the death of a police chief, David Hennessy, after some of them had been acquitted at a trial. It was one of the largest single mass lynching in American history that we know of. Thankfully, a woman named Ida B. Wells Barnett, a fiery journalist, lecturer, and civil rights militant, was best known for her tireless crusade against lynching and her fearless effort to expose the violence against black people. She launched a campaign to publicize the horrors of lynching and began writing and lecturing about it across the country. She wrote 2 pamphlets entitled A. Red Record, Lynchings in the United States, and Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws in All Its Phases. In those words, she wrote 241 lynchings, and in her efforts helped with her writing to the progressive era. What a time it was, the Gilded Era, where times like fancy parties and cool drinks and redlining communities that weren't white was very common despite the large influx of immigration. But it's not like that today. I mean, sure, things are different today, but it's not like the problems we had back then are repeated again. It's not like we have corrupt politicians or economic housing crisis issues or wars on indigenous people, but what a wild concept and what a time, the Gilded Era.
First up, we have what it took to build the Great Wall. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but no, you can't see the Great Wall of China from space. And while the current wall dates back to the Ming Dynasty, most people don't know this not so fun fact about the construction of the monument. According to History.com, it's estimated that around 400,000 laborers lost their lives during the construction of the wall, with the vast majority of their bodies winding up inside or underneath it. And speaking of those laborers, I think it's fair to say they weren't thrilled to be building it in the first place. Back in 221 BCE, when construction began, there weren't nearly enough willing people to drop what they were doing and start working on a superstructure. So the Qin Emperor, Qin Shi Huang, just forced people into doing it for him. They rounded up farmers by the thousands and basically told them build or else, and so they got to building. So now while we marvel at the sheer size of the wall, the loss of lives is on par with war and national tragedy. Really paints a completely different picture. At number 9, we have the construction of Qin Shi Huang's museum. But the forced construction doesn't end with the Great Wall. For 38 years, laborers created the Mausoleum of the first Shen Emperor, the planned final resting place of Shen Shi Huang. Designed on the inside was Shenyang, which was the capital of the Jin Dynasty. The whole thing is situated underneath a 76-meter tall tomb and was designed to replicate the grandeur of his kingdom in the afterlife, and was equipped with various features, including palaces, pavilions, gardens, and treasures. Like the Great Wall, thousands lost their lives in the construction, but he was the man who they believed unified China, so their sacrifice was for a good cause. Today, the mausoleum is more commonly known for its terracotta army, a collection of life-size clay soldiers and horses discovered near their burial site. These sculptures were intended to protect the emperor in the afterlife and were meticulously crafted with individualized features. The whole complex remained unexcavated until 1974, and a vast majority of it still hasn't been discovered, so what else lies beneath remains a mystery. When the Jin Dynasty fell, with it came the Han Dynasty, which is often considered the golden age for China. During this period, they saw advancements in education, literature, agriculture, medicine, and the implementation of the civil service system. During this period, Confucianism became the dominant ideology, as Emperor Wu implemented Confucian principles in governance and established established the civil service examination system to recruit officials based on their merit rather than their hereditary status. The Han Dynasty played a crucial role in opening and developing the Silk Road trade routes, which facilitated cultural and economic exchanges between China and the West. Trade along the Silk Road contributed to the economic prosperity of the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty witnessed significant technological advancements, including the invention of paper, improvements in iron casting, and the use of water-powered mills. Han art and culture flourished during this period. The production of jade and ceramic artifacts, including the famous Han pottery figurines, exemplifies the artistic achievements of the era. But still, the later years of the Han Dynasty were riddled with internal strife, corruption, and the weakening of central authority. In 220 CE, the Han Dynasty officially ended when the warlord Cao Cao's son, Cao Pi, forced Emperor Xian to abdicate, leading to the establishment of the Three Kingdoms period. But were there any other events leading to the Han Dynasty's collapse? A big one of those was the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Things started off when Qiang Chu, who was a Taoist faith healer, claimed to have received a divine revelation that told him to overthrow the corrupt Han Dynasty and establish a utopian society. So Qiang Chu and his followers, who were often identified by the yellow scarves they wore, decided to take action. But who were his followers? Well, they were primarily from the lower classes and were discontented with the government's failure to address widespread poverty, social inequality, and famine. The uprising was widespread and resulted in the seizure of several regions across China. The rebels engaged in guerrilla warfare, attacking government institutions, disrupting trade routes, and spreading their ideology among the populace. This led to a conflict that spanned over 2 decades until in 205 CE, when Zhang Jue was captured and the rebellion lost its momentum. The Yellow Turbans were strong, however, but because China armed their warlords, they would go on to break apart China into 3 kingdoms. So now there's 3 states: Wei, Shu, and Wu. Looking back, this was a popular period in Chinese literature, but it's also remembered for being the bloodiest. While the 3 kingdoms period laid the foundation for subsequent dynasties and played a crucial role in shaping the cultural and historical narrative of China, when the 3 kingdoms era ended, the country's population was only a fraction of what it was beforehand. So who was in charge of each area? First, there was Qiao Wei, founded by Cao Cao and later ruled by his descendants known as the Wei. Next, there was Shu Han, founded by Liao Bei and governed by his successors, including Zhuge Liang, known as Shu. Finally, there was Eastern Wu, founded by Sun Chen. There were constant struggles between the 3, but one of the most famous battles of the 3 kingdoms period was the Battle of Red Cliffs, fought on the Yangtze River. Forces allied with Shu Han and Eastern Wu successfully repelled a larger Cao Wei fleet. The 3 kingdoms period came to an end when the state of Jin emerged victorious and unified China in 280 CE under the leadership of Sima Yan, who established the Western Jin Dynasty. But Western Jin suffered some of these same struggles and internal conflicts. During this time, power struggles among regional warlords and weakened central authority undermined the dynasty's stability. Simultaneously, invasions and pressure from nomadic tribes in the north, notably the Xiongnu and Xianbei, posed continuous threats to the empire's territories. The weakening of the central government's control, coupled with internal strife, gradually eroded the dynasty's power and effectiveness. In 316 CE, rebellions led by the Xiongnu and Xianbei resulted in the overthrow of the Sima family, which ruled the Western Jin Dynasty. And so the collapse of the Western Jin Dynasty marked the end of its efforts to reunify China under a centralized rule. It led to further fragmentation, paving the way for the division of China into the Eastern Jin Dynasty in the south and various northern dynasties during the subsequent period known as the Southern and Northern Dynasties. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and we've ended up in 581 CE in the beginning of the Sui Dynasty. While Sui only lasted for 37 years, the advancements that were made during the period are extraordinary. Around this time, construction of the Great Wall reached its end, and both the northern and southern dynasties unified once again. One major construction was the Grand Canal, which is still the largest artificial river in the world, and to this day spans over 1,500 kilometers long. The canal's initial purposes were improving grain shipments to the capital and helping with military logistics such as transportation of troops, but the new, reliable inland route would ultimately help facilitate domestic trade, the flow of people, and cultural exchange for centuries. But sadly, like the wall and the mausoleum before, unscripted workers were the majority of those who created this, amongst other mega structures. While successful, the Sui dynasty would reach its end following their war with Goguryeo, or one of Korea's 3 kingdoms, resulting in their defeat in 614 CE. 3 years later, Emperor Yang was assassinated, and with his passing came the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty lasted much longer than the Sui, but there's a reason it's often regarded as a high point in Chinese civilization. During this time, Wu Zetian became the first female empress in China's history, and significant advancements were made in arts, literature, and philosophy. philosophy. Populations around this time grew exponentially, and troops in the hundreds of thousands protected the area from surrounding Asian nations. More than that though, this area is mostly known for its poetry. Influential poets Li Bai and Du Fu belonged to this age, whose work set the standard for poets for generations. If not poetry, the time is also known for the advancements and inventions from that time, many of which we still use today. Woodblock painting was refined and made more widespread, gunpowder was refined into the earliest firearms, and the groundworks for mechanical clocks were created before Su Yong would finalize them later. Around this time, Buddhism also started appearing more often, with numbers of Buddhists increasing before Emperor Wuzong would enact policies suppressing it. Like past dynasties, government dysfunction led to its demise in 907 CE, but it still remains an important part of Chinese past. Sadly, the Song Dynasty isn't regarded in a high light. Lasting from 960 to 1279 CE, it is divided into two main periods, the Northern Song and the Southern Song. During its years, it faced challenges from external invasions and eventually succumbed to the Mongol conquest. In the beginning, things were pretty good. The Northern Song Dynasty was a time of cultural flourishing, with significant developments in poetry, painting, calligraphy, and ceramics. As well, the Northern Song era witnessed technological innovations, including the invention of movable printing, the magnetic compass, and the aforementioned mechanical clock. But of course, the Northern Song Dynasty faced external threats from nomadic people, particularly the Qian Liao Dynasty in the north. After the fall of the Northern Song capital, the Southern Song Dynasty was established, but territorial losses and military challenges for the Southern Song Dynasty increased following more pressure from the Mongol Empire, who was led by Kublai Khan, who you may know is the grandson of Chinggis Khan. Following a long and gruesome battle, the Mongols have now taken power. This happened when Kublai Khan, the grandson of Chinggis Khan, as we know, established the Yuan Dynasty after successfully conquering the Southern Song Dynasty in 1279 and unifying China. The Yuan Dynasty implemented administrative reforms that blended Mongol and Chinese administrative practices. The government was organized along traditional Chinese lines, but Mongol elites held top positions. The Yuan Dynasty witnessed a blending of Mongol, Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian cultures. The court was cosmopolitan, with influences from various regions of the Mongol Empire. The Yuan Dynasty maintained diplomatic ties with other parts of the Mongol Empire, the Middle East, and Europe. Travelers were plentiful, including Marco Polo, the Venetian explorer, who visited China during this period. Kublai Khan implemented policies to boost the economy, including the promotion of trade and agriculture. The establishment of relay stations and the use of paper money facilitated trade and communication, but there was a trend that predictably followed the Yuan Dynasty. The later years saw internal strife, financial difficulties, and growing discontent amongst the Chinese population. Numerous uprisings, including the Red Turban Rebellion led by the Ming Dynasty founder Chu Yuanchang, contributed to the collapse of the Yuan Dynasty. In 1368, the Ming Dynasty forces overthrew the Yuan Dynasty, and Chu Yuanchang declared himself the Hongwu Emperor, founding the Ming Dynasty. While the Yuan Dynasty is often criticized for its foreign rule and the challenges faced during its later years, it also left a significant impact on Chinese history and culture. The era contributed to the interconnectedness of various regions within the vast Mongol Empire. Number 10, we have freak shows. Now, I don't know if you watched the American Horror Story show of the same name, or just did some Googling in your spare time, but freak shows were rampant in the Victorian era, and featured some of the world's wildest people, according to the Victorian era people. Not me. Now, everyone knows of the famous ones like the Bearded Lady, but other attractions such as the Dog-Faced Boy and the Living Skeleton were sights people were willing to throw tons of money at to see. But the harsh truth was that the majority of these so-called freaks were brought in before they could realize the decision they'd made, or in some cases, they just didn't have a choice. Some were sold into the circus from slavery, and others were bought from their family for just enough money to support them. So like, here's a crisp $20 bill, enjoy the rest of your life, and now you're a freak. At number 9, we have the 1862 Garing Panic. The July 1862 mugging of Parliament member Hugh Pilkington was enough to jumpstart Victorian London into a craze, and not like a good, fun kind of craze. Pilkington was strangled by his alleged attacker, so now all of London was under the assumption that they too were going to get strangled, and thus began the anti-garroting bonanza. Londoners compared this to the number of criminals being granted parole and not shipped off down under to Australia, and so people campaigned to the government asking for harsher penalties for robberies, which the government saw and was like, oh yeah, sick. Sure, let's do that. And so they created the Anti-Garroting Act of 1863, which brought back flogging as a form of punishment for violent robberies. One positive we did get out of this whole ordeal were some pretty funny looking campaign posters featuring anti-garroting clothing, which includes this precursor to the choker, which I guess is kind of the anti choker. Number 8, we have Jack the Ripper. You know who definitely wasn't helping the cause of people freaking out about being unalived? Jack the Ripper. For those unaware, Mr. the Ripper was an unidentified serial killer active in and around the Whitechapel district of London, England in the autumn of 1888. Attacks that have been attributed to this mysterious figure typically involved female night workers who lived and worked in the East End of London, and their throats were cut prior to abdominal mutilations and the removal of internal organs. This led to, and continues to lead to, rampant speculation that the slayer had some anatomical or surgical knowledge. Rumors that the deaths were connected intensified in September and October of 1888, and numerous letters were received by media outlets and Scotland Yard from individuals purporting to be responsible. The From Hell letter received by George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee was allegedly sent from Jack the Ripper, and it comes with a whole bunch of goodies, which included half of a preserved human kidney, reportedly taken from one of the victims. To this day, the deaths were never solved, and for all we know, Jack the Ripper could still be among us today. They'd be in their 170s more than likely, but hey, I've seen weirder things. I'm on to you, Jack. Number 7, we have Postmortem Photographs. Okay, I understand not wanting to let go of your relative who's passed, but here's some seemingly obvious advice. Don't go and take a picture with them. From 1860 to 1910, postmortem photography was rampant, and what better way to show Grandpa one more time than by snapping a group pic with him front and center. People of all ages were sadly a part of this tradition, and with the rampant spread of disease, these photographs became more and more common as family numbers continued to dwindle. So instead of doing the reasonable thing and lying the person to rest, now you gotta take a photograph with them and show the world just how sad you really are. Fortunately for my eyes and the eyes of everyone worldwide, a good majority of the postmortem photos you see online are actually featuring alive people, as back then, photos could take up to an hour and a half to take, so it's understandable that people's expressions would be annoyed and blank, and yeah, you think school photos were bad? Picture this. But yeah, the ones of people in a casket, yeah, I don't think they're living. At number 6, we have the Great London Beer Flood. Well, if they weren't dealing with garroters and snapping pics of less than living family members, they were probably avoiding taking a dip in the Great London Beer Flood. Picture this, you're just hanging out in the St. Giles district of London, all of a sudden at the Moe and Company brewery, a massive vat containing over 135,000 gallons of beer ruptures, causing a wave of beer to flood the surrounding streets. Now you're sprinting from the very thing you love, as the waves of beer were so powerful that it even knocked down the wall of a nearby pub. And in the most unfortunate form of irony imaginable, the people inside were trapped and some lost their life. So yes, those people suffered an alcohol-related death, and it wasn't the pub's fault. But from the wreckage arose a brand new problem. People were collecting as much beer as they could, or just taking sips of that street beer and getting absolutely sloshed. Eventually, watchmen started charging people to visit, and the people became more respectful, in the end donating to the families who had lost members in the incident. The brewery where it all took place was demolished in 1922, so sadly you can't see firsthand what caused this event, but there's a local pub called the Holborn Whippet that does an anniversary ale every year, which hopefully doesn't taste like street. At number 5, we have the Great London Stink. No, I didn't say the Great London Stick, which is probably what happened to the streets after the beer flood, but instead this is the Great London Stink. This environmental disaster occurred in the summer of 1858 and was caused by the city's inadequate sewage system, which allowed raw sewage and waste to be dumped directly into the River Thames. Gag warning, because the hot weather added on to the problem, causing the sewage to ferment and emit a foul odor that could be smelt throughout the city. In fact, the smell was so overwhelming that it caused widespread illness and forced many people to flee the city. Parliament was forced to act. I mean, thousands of people smelt it and no one dealt it. So a major engineering project was launched to build a modern sewage system for London. This project was led by an engineer by the name of Joseph Bazalgette, who designed a system of sewers and pumping stations that would carry sewage out of the city and into the Thames estuary. The construction of the new sewage system was a massive undertaking involving the excavation of miles of tunnels and the construction of huge pumping stations. It took several years to complete, but once it was finished, it greatly improved the health and hygiene of the city. So no, you can't use the sewage as an excuse when you're in London. Sorry, just admit it was you. At number 4, we have Typhoid Mary. Now you know that Patrick meme where it's like, why don't we take this and put it over here? Well, that's kind of what they did with Typhoid Mary. See, Mary Mallon had the unfortunate distinction of being the person to reportedly affect over 100 people with typhoid fever, and also became the first person found to be an asymptomatic carrier, meaning she had no clue she was causing all of this to happen. After working as a cook for 8 families, in which 7 of them contracted typhoid, the US government found out she was causing all of these illnesses, and so they forcibly sent her to quarantine on North Brother Island. If you're wondering where that is, it's a smallish island not that far away from Rikers, located in New York York's East River. And then she spent almost every single day for the rest of her life there, forced to quarantine from the entirety of society. In fact, 1910 to 1915 were the only years she would spend outside of quarantine, which as a whole she was a part of from the age of 38 until her passing at the age of 69. I hate to break it to you, but North Brother Island is off limits, so no paying respects allowed. Because of all the infectious cases and now rampant asbestos, the government has said the island is a no-go for visitors. In fact, it's actually a bird sanctuary now, so at least it has that going for it. At number 3, we have the Boer Wars. Those of Dutch origin have been in South Africa since the 1600s, and so when England saw what the now Afrikaners were doing in the country, and the pure amount of gold that was being found in the country, they wanted a piece of that. But the Afrikaners, or Boers, were like, nah, this is ours. Was it theirs? I mean, not really. Different areas of now modern-day South Africa, Lesotho, and Eswatini were all colonized by different countries, but the British wanted more, and so conflict started between the Boers, who were the farmers, and the Outlanders. The British Army eventually got backup, including troops from throughout Africa, Canada, and Australia, and they ended up winning the war, effectively proclaiming their right as British South Africans. Years later, this term became White South Africans, and we all know what happened next. But Britain would look at some of the tactics the Boers used on them and would use them going forward in their future conflicts. But that's not to say that Britain's scorched earth tactics weren't also met with criticism, which they rightfully have, but in the end, the fact that the Brits and the Boers had to bring the native people into their conflict is kind of ridiculous. And after all that, they teamed up against the natives. So as someone with South African roots, yeah, it's tough to look back on. At number 2, we have the brown dog affair. If you're a puppy lover, be prepared. This is your heads up. So just to bring you into the loop, the brown dog affair was a controversy that arose in the early 20th century in London over the use of animals in medical research. In 1903, a statue of a brown dog was erected in Battersea, which had been used in vivisection experiments by a scientist named William Bayliss. If you're unfamiliar with that gruesome term, vivisection is defined as the practice of performing operations on live animals for the purpose of experimentation or scientific research. And while I personally am all for the advancement of science, I don't think the ethical studies of this was clearly okay. The statue was intended as a memorial to the countless animals that have been used in medical research, but it was met with outrage from some quarters. Anti-vivisection groups saw it as a symbol of animal cruelty, while some medical researchers saw it as an attack on their work. In 1907, a group of medical students attacked the statue during a protest, sparking a violent confrontation with anti-vivisection activists. The statue was eventually removed by the authorities, but the controversy continued to rage for many years. To that I say, just leave the animals out of this, please, and thank you. Finally, we have the Irish potato famine. There's almost no event more commonly known from the Victorian era than the Irish potato famine. Potatoes are in almost everything, and for the Irish in the 1800s, it was one of their main sources of food. So when a disease starts wiping out all the taters, you can understand the panic that unfolded. To combat this, the Irish government purchased a whole bunch of sweet corn from the United States and initially sold it at a low price, hoping they could at least make a little bit of money off of their hundreds of thousands of starving citizens. New government was brought in, and yet all methods were deemed ineffective, causing the loss of life of somewhere around 1 million people. If people weren't losing their lives in Ireland, they were going to whatever lengths were necessary to leave the country, with a mass influx of immigrants into the United States, Canada, Great Britain, and British North America. In fact, if you add up those who lost their life and those who left the country, around 2.5 million Irish people were no longer in Ireland because of the famine. It took years for the country to recover, and fortunately it did, but the policy failure, along with the mass removal of farmers, made things incredibly difficult for the country.
So we're gonna start with a classic, naturally, a very public affair. In 510, when Catherine of Aragon was expecting their second child, Henry VIII strayed from his marriage for the first time. This was a time era when it was believed intercourse during pregnancy would affect the baby. Seeing as his heir was riding kangaroo style all up in his wife, and Henry had manly needs he evidently just couldn't contain, he found himself in bed with Anne, aka Lady Hastings. He kept his affair with Anne a secret until her own sister, Lady Fitzwalter, wishing to spare their family a scandal, told their brother, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham naturally berated Anne, and her right husband carried her off to a nunnery. The king then showed great displeasure and banished the Lady Fitzwalter from the court. Why? Henry was convinced she had set women to spy on him in order to tell the queen of his adultery. But Henry comes to find out that the Queen Catherine already knew. She didn't need spies, and boy was she pissed. The result was a very public blowout between the couple. Yet it was a wife's duty to maintain a dignified silence in the face of infidelity, and in the end, Catherine conceded defeat and sucked up the fact she married a loser. And while Catherine never provided a male heir, someone did. Let's meet the illegitimate son. Henry had a tendency to marry women that just couldn't provide a son no matter how long he pined for a legitimate male heir. But it did not take long for him to have an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. His mother was an attractive girl about the court named Bessie Blount. Surprisingly, the king acknowledged the crap out of this illegitimate heir. On the 18th of June 1525, in a ceremony in London's Grand Bridewell Palace, then 6 years old, Henry Fitzroy was made the Earl of Nottingham and the Duke of both Richmond and Somerset. The right high noble prince, as the youngster was now styled, had become the highest ranking member of English nobility. Henry loved him like his own soul, the Venetian ambassador reported, and as the king himself put it, Fitzroy was my worldly jewel. Historian contemporaries fully believe Fitzroy was being groomed for the throne before his premature death from consumption. There's a decent amount of evidence to uphold this notion, such as the meeting of the Privy Council of June 1536. The Earl of Sussex declared that Fitzroy would make a better choice of a monarch than Mary, as Mary and Elizabeth were both illegitimates as well. As the princess was a bastard as well as the Duke of Richmond, it would be right to prefer the male to the female, the Earl had said, and Henry agreed. One of the most emotive and spectacular paintings to come out of the French Salon depicts the death of the 9-day queen. So, the third scandal in our countdown is the tragic story of Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen following the death of Edward II. Jane was the granddaughter of Henry VIII and at only 17 years old is proclaimed queen in a desperate bid to maintain Protestant rule in England. So, while she wasn't actually technically next in line, Edward, son and successor of Henry VIII, wanted to keep the Protestant line going, so his written will removed his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from the line on account of their illegitimacy, subverting their claims under the Third Succession Act. Yeah, no, Jane's reign literally lasts 10 days at most. People didn't like the Protestants, and it was very easy for Mary I, the rightful heir, to amass support and overthrow Jane, who I may remind you is not a mastermind seeking power. She is a teenage girl being used as a pawn. Now, to run Mary her credit, she recognized this, and she was lenient by just keeping Jane in the Tower of London. But then it's Jane's father, who's not in prison and going out on the streets protesting Mary like an idiot. He participates in another rebellion against her and uses Jane as a potential figurehead. At that point, Mary's like, I don't know what else I can do. I don't want to kill, but you guys are going to keep rebelling. So her hand is forced to sentence Jane to death and end the rebellions. And speaking of Mary, which we'll be doing a lot, let's get nosy about her mystery heir. It is in 1554, at 38 years old, Bloody Mary, aka Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, began showing signs of her first pregnancy. Rumors spread through Europe like wildfire as the people awaited Mary's firstborn child. Precautions were mapped out to the nines, since this was the first queen to be on the throne, and women tended to drop like MFing flies due to pregnancy back in the day. Mary's husband Philip lined up to marry Mary's half-sister Elizabeth in the event that Mary died in childbirth, because when you're pregnant and violently ill, nothing says you got this babe, I believe in you honey, more than listening to your husband's emergency plan to bang your sister. In the end, no pregnancy ever comes of Mary's symptoms. One theory is that Mary had actually fallen ill and mistaken her morning sickness for being a pregnancy sickness. Some people believe that Mary was in fact pregnant at one time and tragically lost the child. Notoriously, her mother struggled immensely with infertility, and this may have been a genetic issue. From 1558, Mary had another pregnancy scare, and it unfolded the same way. Only this time we know the sickness she mistook for pregnancy was likely caused by either rupturing cysts or cancer. Her sickness couldn't have come at a worse time, with an epidemic of influenza running rampant through the country, and at 42 years old, Mary I dies heirless. Let's flip sides and check on Mary's sister, their stepmother, and that one creepy uncle. So this involves the future Queen Elizabeth and her step-uncle Thomas Seymour after the death of Henry VIII. Following the execution of her mother Anne Boleyn when Elizabeth was only 3, Elizabeth meets a flurry of brides and wives before it all ends with Catherine Parr, who's married to Henry when he dies in 1547. With Edward appointed king, Catherine soon married Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Jane Seymour, who was Henry's favorite wife. Stepmother to Elizabeth, Catherine brings the girl to her and Thomas's home, where Elizabeth is subjugated to late night and early morning visits from the horrible man. Something historians believe affected her for the rest of her life, especially since Catherine, knowing what was happening to Elizabeth, did nothing. When she did, it was only to blame Elizabeth for what happened to her and send her away. Ultimately, Elizabeth gets blamed by a lot of people for what happened to her, and in 1548, the same year Elizabeth is sent away and Catherine dies, Thomas decides it's his time to rise to power. In addition to attempts to strengthen his position by winning over naval forces and trying to now convince Elizabeth to be with him, Thomas concocted a master plan to kidnap King Edward. The king! Kidnap! During his attempted kidnapping, Thomas accidentally kills one of Edward's dogs and is quickly captured by the king's guard. In 1549, Thomas was charged by the crown with 33 counts of treason, including conspiring to marry Elizabeth, who was then second in line to the English throne, and killing a royal dog. He met a brutal end at the Tower of London on March 20th of 1549, with the executioner taking 2 blows of an axe to fully sever his head. I hope Elizabeth could smile and feel a little bit of relief when she heard that news. And speaking of Elizabeth and Anne, let's learn about Mary Boleyn's baby bump. By 1534, having failed to bear Henry a son, Anne Boleyn's influence on him is declining. So, she had a good reason to be humiliated when her widowed sister Mary, also the former spank bank of her own husband the king, appeared at court noticeably pregnant. Turns out good old Mary had secretly married William Stafford, a non-reputable man who was simply the son of a wealthier upper-class landowner. Since Stafford was a soldier and the second-born son in his family, trust me, that weirdly made a difference. His prospects and income were small, and many believed the union was actually out of genuine love as a result, which is something that toxic-ass royal family could not comprehend. Not like any of them had had healthy examples of relationships or raised around loving parents. So yeah, when caught repping a gut, Mary confessed that she had secretly and out of necessity married for love Mr. Plain William Stafford, a younger son of a knightly birth with no fortune. Anne was furious, for Stafford was no match for the Queen's sister. Anne has no hesitation in persuading the king to banish the disgraced couple from the court. It's brutal for them financially, and Mary consistently reaches out to Henry and Anne to have some compassion. She admitted that she might have chosen a greater man of birth, but never one that should have loved her so well, nor a more honest man. To quote, "I had rather beg my bread with him than to be the greatest queen in Christendom, and I believe verily he would not forsake me to be a king." It's Anne who relents, sending Mary a magnificent golden cup and a fat stack of cash. This partial reconciliation was the closest the two sisters ever attained, and they never met face to face again. And why didn't they meet face to face again? Only because of the arguably biggest Tudor scandal there is, the fall of Anne Boleyn. This is the year 1536, and the hottest headline has just hit the news cycle. Turns out Queen Anne's royal garden has let some dirty peasants inside to, how can I say this, water her flowers? To be extremely direct, she was accused of adultery with 5 men, and yes, I'm serious, one was her brother. Dude, could you imagine if that allegation happened now? It would be absolutely insane. Now imagine in an era where women had to wear 36 layers of material to not be called a slag and also had 0 rights. It was all too believable. The state papers contained many cases of people damning Anne, as she clearly enjoyed flirting with men in her circle. Most of these men were arrested, and Anne herself was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where she was watched and her every word reported. Her indiscreet talking about her compromising banter with her alleged lovers literally only reinforced the case against her. The 5 men were condemned to death, and she was subjected to a show trial in the Great Hall of the Tower and found guilty of treason. 4 days later, it was death to Anne Boleyn. Meanwhile, happening at pretty much the same time was an illicit liaison, and I mean same time, quite literally. It was the same summer of 1536 when Henry's own niece, Margaret Douglas, was imprisoned in the Tower under sentence of death. Her crime was also to do with having the audacity to act as a woman with autonomy. She entered into a binding pre-contract of marriage with Lord Thomas Howard, which was treason in the eyes of the king, who was convinced that Thomas had been aspiring for the crown. Fortunately, Henry was fond of Margaret, which means their heads didn't have to be relocated, but their love did. He spared the lovers a sentence of death and commuted it to imprisonment in the Tower. Their love poems still survive and are displayed for the world to see their doomed romance, as Thomas tragically died there of fever in 1537, just days after Margaret had been pardoned, and she was still mourning her lost lover for years later. Similar to Margaret, this family family member was swooped up and away to the tower for the crime of love. Dramatic and romantic. We love a fun mix. This is about Catherine Grey's secret pregnancy and how in 1562, her cousin Elizabeth I has Catherine arrested and taken to, you guessed it, Tower of London. Why? She had dared to secretly marry her lover, Edward Seymour. Catherine was the elder of the two surviving sisters of Lady Jane Grey. From the moment she came to the throne, Elizabeth made it clear she could not abide the sight of Catherine, probably to do with the fact she was hella sensitive about her own legitimacy issues due to the whole dad killed mom thing. Follow that up with the fact older sis Mary killing Catherine's older sis Jane thing, Elizabeth naturally distrusted any other persons of royal blood to not want to get revenge or her throne, particularly those whose place in the succession had been confirmed by the Act of Parliament, as Catherine's had. In 1560, Catherine married Edward Seymour, the nephew of Jane Seymour, out of love. For a person of royal blood to marry without the monarch's consent was treasonous, and when Elizabeth heard of it, she wasted no time placing Catherine, who was already pregnant, and her new husband in the tower. Catherine gives birth to a son, and Elizabeth is pissed. She puts orders from now on Catherine and her husband have to be kept strictly apart. Turns out when you aren't a snobby twit, you can make friends with the guards. So February 1563, Catherine gives birth to a second son in the tower. Hilariously, two of their guards meant to keep them apart stand as the godfathers at the christening. When Elizabeth found out, her fury knew no bounds. The Spanish ambassador observed that she turned the color of a corpse. She ordered that Catherine and her husband be removed immediately from the tower and sent to different places of imprisonment. No matter how many times Catherine wrote and begged, Elizabeth never changed her mind. Catherine's health suffered a serious decline, exacerbated by her refusal to eat and serious depression. In January 1568, she died, aged just 27. "In the world to come, I hope to live forever," she told one of her attendants, "for here is nothing but care and misery." Alright, our last dirty dish of drama on the list will debate victim or vixen. Called his rose without a thorn, Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, has received mostly apathy since her death on the 13th of February 1542. Catherine Howard is a woman in control of her sensuality in a time it is not accepted, and it can be routed back to her youth being raised by the Dowager Duchess Agnes Howard. She was comfortably accepting of letting the girls in her care explore their adult bodies as they got older, as long as they didn't go too far with anyone. This type of openness was rare and allowed Catherine to develop a basis of what she bodily enjoyed, but also that she could experience bodily enjoyment. Catherine lost her virginity out of wedlock and turned down the man who had taken it, Baram, when he offered marriage. She didn't want to marry her first adult partner. She knew ways to prevent herself from falling pregnant, and given that marriage was all she'd been raised for, was understandably hesitant to tie herself down to the first person when she just discovered the joys of intercourse with none of the responsibility. Like two of her predecessors, her ill-fated cousin Anne Boleyn and Henry's beloved third wife Jane Seymour, Catherine caught Henry's attention as a lady-in-waiting to the queen who preceded her, Anne of Cleves. Young and full of life, Catherine enchanted him. Nothing was too good for her, and her family was quick to encourage his affection and brush Catherine's past relationship with Dereham and other men under the carpet. Catherine might have survived the king, or at least survived a little bit longer, if it wasn't for her relationship with Thomas Culpeper. Sure, there's no confirmation they consummated the relationship similar to her and Henry Mannix, but what about sneaking a man into your room who isn't your fat, ugly husband? Looks good, homegirl. Henry's initial reaction to the accusations was one of fury. He demanded an investigation be carried out and dispel what he believed to be vile rumors, and turns out everybody is stupid. Literally everyone folds, no pressure, and it just admits to everything. Mannix, Dereham, Culpeper, even Catherine breaks down crying and admits she let Dereham enter her magic gardens, but no other man. Doesn't matter to Henry though, and everyone's sentenced to death. Number 10 is the annual exorcism that renders the whole month of May unlucky for marriages, hence the proverb, bad girls wed in May, aka Lemeralia, a whole private behind closed doors holiday dedicated to kicking ghosts out of your house. It dates back to hella pagan times, the 6th century BCE, and only seemed to tamper out around the 3rd. Held only on the lucky dates of May 9th, 11th, and 13th, philosopher Ovid tells us in his writings Fasti that Romulus began this tradition to appease the restless and angry spirit, otherwise called Lemurs in Roman times, of his brother whom he killed. The head of the household was responsible for getting up at night, washing his hands in spring water, and walking through the home with his hands like this. He would either take a mouthful or handful of black beans and then spit them or throw them over his shoulder to the hungry spirits, repeating the following incantation 9 times. I send these with these beans, I redeem me and mine. While dad is doing that, give your kids some pots and pans and tell them to reenact Stomp. The household member's role is to clash bronze pots while repeating, "Ghosts of my fathers and ancestors, be gone." The householder washes his hands in spring water 3 times, rinse and repeat for 3 days, pun intended. The Lemaralia was meant to help those family members who had died in circumstances that prevented or delayed their admission to the afterlife. This could be dying before your time, or through sudden disease, war, misadventure, or a circumstance that would prevent a proper burial. On the 3rd day, they lightened the energy a little. A merchant's festival and fair was held to ensure a prosperous year for business. Number 9 is how Rome couldn't handle when badass Carthaginian general came a-knockin'. It's the Hannibal Invasion. The Carthaginians had lost Rome in the First Punic War, and that was no picnic for anyone involved. The fragile truce called between the nations of Rome and Carthage was tenuous, and Rome was taking more and more control over the Mediterranean Sea by the day, which both economies heavily depended on. Just like in a movie, from the shadows of the concerned Carthaginians came Hannibal, the hot new young general on the scene and the son of Hamilcar, one of the best Carthaginian generals. Now, in the wake of his father's death, with the Roman rage train rolling and something to prove, Hannibal forms his own plan, one that became known as one of the most significant historical events of ancient Rome. They would come to Italy and descend from the Alps. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal led one of the biggest military journeys in history, and what would follow was a series of increasingly catastrophic disasters for the Roman Senate. The first major pitched battle at the river Trebia in December of 218 saw over half the deployed Roman forces eradicated. The Roman consul Flaminius overreacts and pursues Hannibal's army into the hills of Lake Trasimene in June of 217, where they're ambushed and a total of 15,000 Romans are killed. Now, a consul is dead and a significant portion of the army is gone. Instead of recollecting calmly, Rome continues to panic, and the newly elected consuls are given 20,000 Roman men each, as well as 40,000 supplementary troops from Roman allies, stocking an army of around 80,000 men. Imagine being a civilian right now, just everyone is being called for draft men every day, they leave en masse, never return. It's with these forces that the consuls confronted Hannibal at the Roman supply base Cannae, where he had taken. But they did it without taking into account the flat terrain, heavily favored the Carthaginian cavalry. Lo and behold, it's a downright killing spree, and out of the 80,000 men who fought, only 14,500 Romans escaped death or captivity. Let's talk about some more Roman political fumbles. In number 8, the year of 4 emperors. Nero, the emperor who started his reign fabulously only to end it universally despised, was the first emperor to definitively take their own life. He did this with a lot of pomp and flair, but also without leaving an heir. This set up an immense power grab into motion, leading to the year of 4 emperors in 69 AD. So let's do a credit run for these guys, shall we? Galba, who follows Nero, pretty much killed every distinguished man without a trial for petty differences. But then, when the people of Rome called upon him to punish 2 corrupt legions, he gave them honors and promotions. He also allowed his friends to wield taxation and condemnation as political favors. He gets killed by his own guards and his body laid in the street until a common soldier sought its head and delivered it to Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho, now elected emperor, immediately has Vitellius on it, refusing all offers of peace settlements and demanding a battle. Otho loses 40,000 men to him, and the man who tells him this takes his life at Otho's feet. Otho couldn't tough it, so he said goodbye to his loved ones, dispersed his wealth, took his own life. The Senate immediately hands Vitellius the throne to spare themselves more battle. Was a gluttonous dirtbag. Disregarding democracy, he mimicked Nero in setting himself up to be the supreme power. He held his position for 8 months before the founder of the Flavian dynasty, Titus Flavius, suddenly had the legions of Syria, Alexandria, Moesia, Pannonia, Illyricum declaring him the emperor, and the terrified Vitellius disguises himself with rags and tries to escape the city, but fails. Next is the emperor who essentially lived as if in a cartoon. Number 7 is Caligula's reign. Living in Rome at the same time as this guy would be a nightmare on the sole basis alone. His favorite phrase was, "Remember, I have the right to do anything to anybody," because that is what you want to hear from your leader, and he was someone who took it quite literally. This included banging his friends' wives, or the torment and subsequent killing of high-ranking senators who dared to disagree with him. He even turned killing into a sport and just attacked people at random. Caligula famously caused a famine by draining the Roman treasury, having built vast monuments to his own greatness. After raising taxes to get some more petty cash, Caligula's spending quickly became out of control. In one famous incident, he arranged for hundreds of merchant ships to form a 3-mile-long floating bridge across the bay, which he galloped back and forth across on his horse for 2 days wearing a golden cape. Caligula wasn't like this at the beginning of his reign, when he led a series of political reforms and even recalled all the exiles miles from outside of Rome, but something shifted after a few months, which can be attributed to maybe a serious illness, leading Caligula to become increasingly erratic and deranged. He ordered his men to attack the beach and declared himself a god, appearing in public dressed as various gods and demigods. And he also removed the heads of gods' statues to put his own atop. He was the first Roman emperor to be killed in a coup. On to number 6, which is the crisis of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic lasted for nearly 500 years, but the crisis of the Roman Republic was nowhere near as long, rather a decades of political instability that fed social unrest from 134 to 44 BC. During this period, Rome was often at war with its neighbors while simultaneously dealing with crippling civil wars and coups as aristocrats tried to hang on to their exclusive rights and privileges against the pressure from the rest of society. So many captured people were brought into the country, it created an influx of free labor which hurt the lower classes and disrupted the agricultural system, forcing small farmers to sell their land. Wealthy people bought votes and gave favors to their friends. Bribery and corruption were rampant and led to commoners distrusting Senate, and without a police force, crime was out of control. When Rome's conquests declined, so did their sources of income. This decrease in money resulted in a loss for the people of Rome and created enormous stress on that economy. Officials began to tax their citizens, furthering the peasant rage. The rise of Julius Caesar as a dictator led to civil war from 49 to 45 BC and saw Roman armies fighting each other in Italy, Spain, Greece, and Egypt. This, along with economic problems, government corruption, crime, and private arms, all led to the eventual fall of the Roman Republic in 27 BCE. And since it ties in so nicely, number 5 will be the fall of Rome. After the Republic eats it, Augustus can be accredited with the establishment of the Roman Empire. He successfully curb-stomped Mark Antony during the Battle of Atticum in 31 BC, and Cleo takes herself out of commission. Augustus sets up an excellent governing system and military, bringing Rome wealth, trade, and very few military defeats. The empire reached its peak when the territory stretched from the English-Scottish border to Saudi Arabia in 117 CE, with a population high of 70 million, which was 20% of the population of the world at the time. What he can't bring Rome, however, despite all the social reforms and religious control and successful conquests, is the peace they seemingly lost. The constant civil war, financial ruin, and clan invasions had demolished the kingdom's confidence, as proven by how far the barbarian clans even made it into the Roman territories, and when the city of Rome was sacked by the Goths, it led to the final fall of the empire in 476 CE. Number 4 covers the months following Caesar's death. It's the Alaskan volcano, which we now know is to blame for the unusual weather, plagues, and famines following the death of, as said, Caesar in 44 BCE. Ancient writers who survived the period described the sun's mysterious disappearance, unseasonably cold weather, short growing seasons if not completely failed crops, and widespread famine around the Mediterranean from Rome to Egypt. Throughout the empire, starvation led to disease and fueled growing civil unrest in already turbulent times. Sources document famines in northern Italy by April of 42 BCE and northern Greece of the next year. Famines are seen in Egypt, and it's speculate that they weakened that country, making it the perfect moment for Octavian to conquer it and solidify his hold on the nascent empire. A recent study of Greenland ice cores now suggests that the volcanic culprit is Mount Okmok in what's now Alaska, half a world away from Rome, whose smoke and smog block the sun and slow-spreading sulfur affect crops. Letters from Cicero, the Roman statesman whose death in 42 BC is considered the symbolic end of the Republic, mention cold weather around the time of the eruption, and the dated accounts show the slow travel of the volcano's toxins through the empire. Speaking of toxicity in Rome, let's do mass expulsions for number 3. These periods were known as the drastic points in ancient Roman history. Romans didn't really care for race or sexuality as long as you dressed, talked, and behaved like a Roman. That's all that was needed to be respected in their society, immigrant or otherwise. But without holding a Latin status, immigrants had very little protection. As a result, multiple times in Roman history, nobles and emperors alike decided to kick folks out, and for a variety of reasons. You're a lawyer, doctor, or a construction worker, doesn't matter how helpful you are out. Don't have a homeland to return to? Doesn't matter. Naturally, thousands would starve just outside of the kingdom's gates for that reason. However, a mass expulsion could calm angry Roman citizens looking for someone to blame during a famine, war, or plague. Generally something or anything that would cause shortages. Religions such as Judaism or Roman paganism was often a target for expulsion, as seen in 98 BCE and 177 BCE. Professions could also be targeted. Cicero writes of an expulsion of philosophers in 126 BCE. It may not be right, of course, for one who is not a citizen to exercise the rights and privileges of citizenship, and the law on this point was secured by two of our wisest consuls. Still, to prevent foreigners from enjoying the advances of the city is ultimately altogether contrary to the laws of humanity. In a time of famine, Suetonius talks of how Augustus expelled owned people and gladiators. Once indeed a time of great scarcity, when it was difficult to find remedy, Augustus expelled from the city the laborers that were for sale, as well as the schools of gladiators, all foreigners with the exception of physicians and teachers and a part of the household servants. And what better to follow up expulsion than something that caused one? Number 2 is the plague of 165 AD, whose victims would fall to fever and chills with diarrhea starting red that turned black within a week. During that time, black pockmarks would scab their bodies to peel off and leave deep-ditched wounds. Towards the end, people would even cough up or excrete scabs that had formed inside of them. Like some beast, a contemporary wrote, the sickness destroyed not just a few people, but rampaged across whole cities and destroyed them. Victims would suffer for 2, sometimes 3 weeks before dying or recovering by minor miracle. This was smallpox in its first form. The Romans had dealt with malaria, intestinal wasting diseases, and worms living in putrefying wounds that would refuse to heal. But smallpox was something that began as a terrifying rumor from the east, spreading through conversation that simultaneously transmitted news of the disease and the virus itself. The smallpox plague remained in Rome for a generation, finding a peak in the year 189 when it was taking as many 2,000 people per day. It decimated the aristocracy to such a degree that town councils couldn't meet, local magistrates went unfulfilled, and community organizations failed. Abandoned farms and depopulated towns dotted the countrysides from Egypt to Germany. Alrighty, last but never the least on the list, number 1 is horrific banquets. Roman history written between 211 and 233 by Dio Cass describes a hellish meal hosted by Emperor Domitian in the year 89. It was an event seemingly designed to torment its participants. The room was completely black, from the floor to the ceiling to the table. The guests, most of whom were senators, were each assigned a personalized gravestone seat. The food served was traditionally offered as sacrifices to departed spirits, and it was all also colored to be black. Every single one of the guests feared and trembled and was kept in constant expectation of having his throat cut at the next moment, writes Cassius. Domitian apparently relished in their terror, conversing only upon topics relating to death and demise. Whether or not this dinner actually happened, it falls into a subsection of very real dinner entertainment from the past, categorized by the late historian Phyllis Pray Barber as black or hell banquets, were designed to evoke funeral services at the least or afflictions of hell itself at the worst. One famous Roman account was in March of 1519, Lorenzo di Filippo Strozzi's home. It said that a few flickering candles revealed skulls, skeletons. According to one account, no one wanted to eat because it was such a terrifying scene, and when his guests couldn't take any more, apparently at least 2 cardinals vomited that day, Strozzi orchestrated the grand finale, cracking open the skull and bones to reveal they were fakes made of sugar and filled with roast pheasant and sausages.
Number 10. President Edith Wilson. In the year 1919, President Woodrow Wilson experienced a severe stroke that greatly impacted his abilities. However, instead of publicly disclosing this information, this very personal information, the government chose to maintain secrecy, believing that it was in the best interest of the nation. Now, what happened next was pretty amazing. The public remained unaware of Wilson's stroke for several months, but during this time, Edith Wilson took on a significant role in making executive decisions on his behalf. So in retrospect, historians now acknowledge that Mrs. Wilson effectively assumed the role of one U.S. president for the remainder of Wilson's term. This remarkable circumstance highlights the fact that a woman, Edith Wilson, effectively held the reins of the country's leadership through the year 1920, which is amazing. We don't talk about that nearly enough. Number 9. Stay thirsty. On January 16th, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States came into effect, initiating the era known as the Prohibition. This was a sad one. This was a pretty lousy one right here. This amendment outlawed the sale of booze, leading to the closure of taverns, bars, saloons, every fun place that you can meet people and have a good time, all shut down, as well as the removal of liquor from store shelves. However, despite the ban on sales, it's important to note that the amendment did not criminalize the act of drinking alcohol itself. So if you just found it, you were good. So it comes to no surprise that the consumption of alcohol persisted, probably even more so, but at that point it was driven into an underground market dominated by criminal figures like Al Capone. That was until the amendment's repeal in 1933. Number 8. Olympic flag debut. During the 1920 Summer Olympics held in Belgium, a significant symbol of unity was introduced to the world. High jump. No, I'm just kidding. The Olympic flag in its current form. It consisted of 5 interlocking rings, and these rings were chosen to represent the harmonious connection between continents and nations, and this was following the aftermath of World War I. They're like, I got it. A nice flag, but also high jump. Please high jump. The event also witnessed the release release of doves. How beautiful is that? This is a powerful symbol of peace, further emphasizing this desire, this dream for global harmony in the form of high jump. It's so funny when people come together, they're like, yes, let's do it as a unity together, and all right, throw that javelin, try and beat that guy now. Good luck, break a leg. Number 7, Amelia Earhart's first flight. In the year 1897, Amelia Earhart was born, destined to make an incredible mark on aviation history. Her transformative journey began in 1920 when she had the opportunity to take her first ever airplane ride, albeit as a passenger alongside the renowned World War I pilot Frank Hawks. Now this experience proved to be quite pivotal. It ignited a deep passion within her for flight. And in her own words, Amelia expressed, "As soon as we left the ground, I knew that I myself had to fly." Amelia Earhart wasted no time in pursuing her newfound ambition. She enrolled in flying lessons, displaying exceptional dedication and talent, obviously, and within a year, by 1921, she had already achieved the remarkable feat of flying solo, marking the beginning of her extraordinary journey as an aviator. I had a buddy trying to be a pilot, and it took him so long, so the fact that you can do this in a year and be so good, damn, with those like janky planes back then too, that are shaking as they're trying to get off the ground, no, that's incredible. Number 6, Alexander Fleming. In September 1928, Alexander Fleming, already a successful microbiologist at the time, just stumbled upon his greatest discovery entirely by chance. Must be nice. He's like, oh, we changed the world. Look at that. Upon returning to his laboratory after a well-deserved break, he observed some culture plates containing staphylococci that had become contaminated with mold. And to his surprise, he noticed that the area surrounding this mold remained clear, indicating that it possessed a unique effect on said bacteria. Dubbing the strain penicillin, we love that, it's a pretty good one, Fleming and his assistants embarked on a series of tests that would forever revolutionize the field of medicine. I'm like, thank you so much. Thank you, Alexander, for just looking down. That's so great. This accidental finding was hailed as the single greatest achievement in combating diseases, leading to the dawn of the antibiotic age. Again, we love that, especially today. We're like, yes, keep that up. Let's keep that science up, please. Number 5. The sky is the limit. The 1920s witnessed remarkable advancements in aviation, right? As I just explained. Airplanes were becoming a widely accepted mode of transportation, but 2 significant milestones unfolded during this decade, shaping the course of aviation history. The first extraordinary achievement was by Charles Lindbergh, who embarked on an unprecedented solo flight way across the Atlantic Ocean. He flew from New York to Paris, May 1927. The historical feat captured the world's attention, showcasing the potential of aviation for long-distance travel. Also, so terrifying to be the first person to fly over the ocean. I'd be like this the entire time. I couldn't breathe. I can't breathe right now just talking about it. The following year, Amelia Earhart made her mark by becoming the first woman to traverse the same transatlantic route. Although she participated as a passenger, this sparked her entire life and history, so we'll say this is 2 in 1. Number 4, TV. How are you watching this? Are you watching it on your phone late at night? Should be sleeping, getting ready for work in the morning? Or are you watching it proudly on your TV? Also, should be going to sleep, but you're staying up watching YouTube. Nice. The first television invention dates back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, various inventors contributed to its development, took a few steps, that's for sure, but one notable pioneer was Philo Farnsworth. Great name also, Farnsworth, what a great time. In 1927, Farnsworth successfully demonstrated the first fully functional electronic television system, and it was known back then as the image dissector. Yeah, are you watching this on your image dissector right now? Give us a thumbs up on your dissector, thank you. His invention utilized a cathode ray tube to capture and transmit images through a series of electronic components. I have no idea how it works, but I love that it does. Big fan of that. Farnsworth's breakthrough led to the foundation for advancements in television technology, leading to the widespread adoption of TV as a form of modern entertainment. Again, big fan. I have like 4 TVs, man. This is ruining my life, really. Number 3, radio. Video killed the radio star, but they had a really good run for a bit there. They had a couple good years. In the year 1920, a significant milestone in communication occurred with the launch of the first commercial radio station in the United States, KDKA, based in Pittsburgh. Now, this event marked a transformative shift in how Americans access news and spent their leisure time. A lot of time listening to radio after that. They just sat down and just listened for a bit. The radio quickly gained popularity, and by the end of the 1920s, approximately 12 million households had radios. A lot of distractions going on. The invention of radio broadcasting revolutionized how we took information, entertainment, and cultural content, connecting people across the land. And also, it was fun to listen to music. That's the most of what we do with that. Do you listen to the radio still? I feel like there's like 2 people that do, and they're both my grandparents. That's about it. Number 2, American football. The birth of American professional football can be traced back to August 1920, when the American Professional Football Association was established, eventually evolving into the renowned National Football League, the NFL, which we all, of course, know. The sport itself had originated as a variation of rugby, incorporating elements from the other type of football as well, and then they began gaining popularity in the 1880s. But by the 1910s, football had emerged as a spectator sport. It was bringing in audiences all across the United States. Now it's starting to get real. I have no idea how to play football. I have no idea how to watch football either. I just look at it, I'm like, cool, who's winning? What are they doing? Why aren't they playing? Who's talking? I don't know. They're just throwing things in while they're trying to play. I have no idea. I'm more of a water polo kind of guy. Know what I mean? And finally, number 1, voting rights. Of course. Of course. The journey towards women's voting rights in America was far too long. It culminated in the passing of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution in 1920, granting women the right to vote. Finally. This achievement was the result of decades of activism, protest, and advocacy with the help of suffragettes Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The suffrage movement gained momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as women fought for their political and social equality. The 19th Amendment marked a significant milestone in American history, of course. It expanded the democratic participation and it advanced gender equality. Cut to 100 years later, we're still working on it somehow, so hopefully we figure it out soon, right? Kicking off our list at number 10, the field of the cloth of gold. Way too many words right off the hop. In 1520, King Henry VIII of England, he hosted a lavish birthday celebration for, well, himself, of course, he's a king, obviously, for himself, and a diplomatic summit with King Francis I of France. 2 kings, 1 epic party. Here we go. The event took place in France and included elaborate feasts, jousting tournaments, okay, that's pretty distracting, and displays of wealth and power by both monarchs on both sides. Now, the summit aimed to strengthen the alliance between both England and France, of course, with the fun jousting happening in the corner. Again, so distracting at a banquet. But ultimately, it did little to resolve their long-standing conflicts. The Field of the Cloth of Gold is remembered as one of the most extravagant events of the Renaissance period, with each monarch trying to one-up the other the entire time. It turned into an absolute joke. One king would serve dolphin and the other king would come and serve swan. It was a lavish cook-off for 18 days straight. Yeah, the party lasted 18 days, so no one's lasting the entire time. Today, this 18-day party would have cost around $19 million, give or take a couple of swans. And dolphins? Monsters, absolute monsters. Number 9, safety coffins. Not to be confused with the safety dance, also quite fun. During the 18th century, there was a brief trend of designing safety coffins. Everybody thought they were the next Tony Stark. They wanted to make the coolest coffin. Weird brag. To get a patent on one of these bad boys, this was next level. They were made to prevent people from, being buried alive, but again, in style. These coffins were equipped with air tubes, bells, and even escape hatches, which would allow someone who was mistakenly thought to be dead to signal for help or even escape their box of death. Now, the thing is, many of these designs were very impractical or ineffective altogether. They were bull. These tubes were just a rat highway into your mouth while you were stuck in a coffin. It was horrible. God forbid you actually woke up in a coffin alive. Now you have to watch bugs and rats crawl out of this air tube until you actually did die. Some would say it's even worse than the original issue at hand. That's horrible. I'm itchy just thinking about that. Number 8, Andrew Jackson's pet parrot. I love animals. I had a bird for a hot minute there. Not the best animal in the house, but it's kind of fun. I don't know, he sucked at flying. Andrew Jackson, he was the 7th president of the United States, and he had a pet parrot named Paul. Pet parrot named Paul. There we go. It's a alliteration for my theater kids over at home there. The bird became famous for its foul language, which it had picked up from its owner, of course. Now, when Jackson died in 1845, his funeral was held in Tennessee. Now, Paul, the parrot, the loyal parrot, mind I remind you, he was present at the funeral and was reportedly making so much noise that it disrupted the proceedings. Now, according to the legend, Paul was eventually removed from the funeral after swearing loudly. They're like, yeah, get your little parrot feet, get out of here, fly, shoo. That's pretty amazing. A parrot getting kicked out for swearing, it sounds made up, but hopefully that one's true. That would break the tension for sure. I don't know. I can't help but get the giggles every time I'm at a funeral. I can't help it. Some historians believe this story was made up just to stain the president's history, but either way, I like it. I like to imagine a parrot being escorted out of a funeral, just like this, nice and calm, and then one brief let go at the end there. That's how you let go of a bird. You gotta go slow, and then there's that one moment of like, you have to do it, no turning back. Here he goes, he's gone. Number 7, animal court. Speaking of birds and parrots, these little mouthy things. Animal trials were a real legal practice that emerged in medieval Europe and it lasted all the way until the 18th century, which is way too long for animals to be showing up in court. These trials involved pigs, cows, and even insects. Yeah, a ladybug took the stand. and then just flew off at some point. These animals were charged and tried in court. The animals were often accused of crimes such as theft, taking one's life, and sometimes even witchcraft. Yeah, that's amazing. They were usually assigned a lawyer and a legal defense team, and the trials were conducted in the same way as human trials were, which is so funny. Real people had to wake up and go here. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall during one of these hearings. You know, as long as I'm not the fly on the stand, we're all good. The verdicts of animal trials varied, but many animals were found guilty and then sentenced to death by hanging or burning. Again, imagine a praying mantis being hung in the middle of town square. Like, what? Who's going to watch this? Who's representing this? More importantly, the trials were often seen as a way for human beings to assert their dominance over the natural world, I guess, sure, and they were widely criticized by religious leaders and philosophers. Number 6, Lake Peigneur. In 1980, Louisiana's Lake Peigneur was accidentally drained after a drilling rig penetrated a salt mine right beneath it, just directly beneath it. The odds here, this was crazy. What a horrible surprise down below, my God. The drilling rig was owned by the Texaco Oil Company, and the accident was caused by of course, a miscalculation in the well's trajectory. As the drilling rig penetrated the mine, it created a hole that quickly grew in size, causing the lake to drain into the mine below. The lake drained like a massive bathtub. This event created a massive whirlpool that lasted for several hours. It pulled in trees, boats, and even a nearby drilling platform all into this watery vortex. Like something out of Pirates of the Caribbean 3, or whatever one that was, where there's a massive whirlpool. It's haunting. It's the worst way to go. Remarkably, no human lives were lost in this disaster, which is so impressive. Today, Lake Peigneur has largely returned to its former state, although this time around it's now much smaller and shallower than it once was. Because, you know, it got drained. How terrifying is that? Number 5, the Great Stink. This one's fucking so funny. Where was this in Peaky Blinders? This would have been a great season. Everyone's just walking around plugging their nose. The Great Stink of London was a major environmental crisis that occurred in the summer, the real hot summer of 1858. Now at the time, the River Thames, which flowed through the heart of the city, it was heavily polluted with raw sewage, industrial waste, human shit, animal shit, so much shit. Pretty much everything and all horrible things you can imagine, all in this flowing hot soup of garbage. The hot summer weather made the problem 1,000 times worse, and it caused the river to emit a putrid odor that covered the entire city. It was just a blanket of stink and depression. The stench was so overwhelming that it disrupted business. It caused widespread illness and even forced Parliament to suspend its sessions. Yeah, it was so stinky, even Parliament's like, ew, no, we'll just talk later. Just go home. Everyone stop. The crisis prompted widespread public outcry, I would hope, and ultimately led to the construction of a new sewer system for the entire city. Thank God. I was really hoping for some sort of solution there. The new system was completed in the 1870s and dramatically improved public health in London by reducing the incidence of waterborne diseases such as cholera. Yeah, get rid of that, clean some things up. Yeah, maybe it'll help. It took 10 years to fix the sewage. How brutal is that? My God, 10 years. Number 4, closer to the heart. Oh, this is so fucked up. Back in 1822, the poet Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, OG writer, here we go. Well, one of her deep dark secrets was accidentally discovered. I would be haunted by this one if I found this. After the death of her husband, very sad, of course, yes, Mary kept his heart in a silk shroud in her desk. Like his actual real life heart, just wrapped up, little piece of him just tucked in that third shelf down. Just slam it shut, and there we go. The exact reason for this unusual act is not clear, but it's believed that Mary was deeply devoted to her husband and wanted to keep a part of him with her at all times. Or again, 3 cupboards down, just slammed in the back next to the Crayolas. The heart was eventually discovered by Shelley's son, who removed it from the desk, thank God, and then buried it with his father's body, away from the desk, like outside in the ground, something kind of normal. Again, being a fly on that wall, what does that conversation sound like? The son's like, hey, found something, I don't know, let's talk about it. Number 3, the Battle of Los Angeles. Seeing as the Pentagon had another leak recently, it's always fun when they leak stuff, let's talk about the biggest false alarm ever. Or was it? The Battle of Los Angeles, otherwise known as the Great Los Angeles Air Raid, it happened during World War II, right at the end of February 1942. This event, first of all, it took place only a few months after the Pearl Harbor attacks, so everybody was obviously, you know, immensely stressed out, to say the least. Something like 25 enemy aircraft was spotted flying over Los Angeles in the late hours of February 24th. So at that point, appropriately, air raids blasted off. Blackouts were then put in effect. This was not a drill. real. Or was it? We don't really know yet. Artillery fire, machine guns, anti-aircraft shells, all blasted off, shot pointed somewhere in the sky, hopefully to hit something. In total, around 1,400 shells were shot off. 2 people had heart attacks because of the noise. 5 people died in total from this retaliation, and it was all apparently a false alarm. A press conference was held by the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and he called the incident war nerves, and that there was nothing actually flying above. Although now we think it was UFOs, so I don't know. What do you guys think it was? Nothing? You think it was UFOs? Do you think it was just war nerves? I think it was probably nothing. It was just nothing. Number 2, the Battle of the Stray Dog. Oh, love animals. Love when they just cause battles. That's great. The Battle of the Stray Dog was a bizarre incident that occurred in 1925 between Greece and Bulgaria. Now, it began when a Greek soldier was chasing a stray dog and he accidentally crossed the border just a little too far to the left. He crossed the border into Bulgaria, leading to a heated confrontation with Bulgarian troops. Now, the incident quickly escalated into this full-blown battle, again, with this dog standing in the middle, not knowing what it's caused, with artillery fire and thousands of troops on both sides running at each other. Now, the conflict lasted for several days before a ceasefire was eventually declared. Now, although relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, the Battle of the Stray Dog highlights the complex and often volatile nature of geopolitical tensions and the unpredictable events that can lead to armed conflicts, like, say, I don't know, a stray dog being anywhere at the wrong time. So by the time the International Committee negotiated a ceasefire to clear up this obvious misunderstanding, 50 people had already lost their lives. So keep those leashes on, folks. You know, dog parks only, I guess. And finally, number 1, the dancing plague. This is the funniest thing ever. I'll talk about this until I go out, honestly. July 1518, one of the most bizarre events in medieval history went down. And it's horrible, but humans did not help this cause. Humans were just the worst here. The town of Strasbourg was calm, cool, and collect one summer back in 1518 until out of nowhere one woman began to dance uncontrollably in the streets. Others soon joined her, and eventually there were over 400 people dancing the days away. Now, it's really tragic here because this was not a good time. A good amount of people here lost their lives due to exhaustion alone. Like, it sounds like a fun thing. We think back to it, it's like, oh, the dancing plague. People started playing music. The authorities tried their best to help the situation, so they paid for musicians to perform for them while they were convulsing in the street. Again, not helpful here, guys. We need some medicine, maybe something else is going on. We don't need a guy with a banjo to come up and liven up the streets while 40 people are having seizures. Not really gonna help. This happened a few times in Europe as well, a few dancing plagues between the 14th and the 17th centuries, and we still don't know exactly what happened here. All we do know is that it was some sort of illness and that it was not like Step Up. It wasn't a dance circle, it wasn't cool, it wasn't sick, all right? We don't need a guy playing guitar. This was bad. This was like a sickness.
Noted most famously in the Iliad, Agamemnon was the king of Mycenae who led the Greeks during the Trojan War. After the fall of Troy, he returned home triumphantly, only to discover that his own wife, Clytemnestra, had taken on a lover by the name of Agastheus. The poor man witnessed his ride or die to his assumed ride or die, riding somewhere else. According to legend, Agamemnon had sacrificed one of his daughters, Iphigenia, in order to please Artemis, in order to secure his victory at Troy. So it was understandable that his wife might be bearing a little bit of a grudge against him, and she was probably hoping that he would die in the battle. But now that he was back, his wife wanted him dead and plotted with her lover to make it happen. In some versions, Agathes, the lover, simply attacked him in the band of assassins. Other legends state that his own wife did the deed herself by stabbing her husband in the bath. But in this case of this, it could be possibility of the worst betrayal is to trying to do a little mini spa day for yourself, only for your spa to completely ruining it by gutting you in. On a lighter note, sort of, is the one and only John Glenn. In 1962, John Glenn made history as America's first official astronaut to orbit the Earth. In doing so, marked a major advancement in space and space focused in American history. And once he was able to complete his missions, he was guaranteed popularity and was noted as the most liked man in the country. He ran for politics and actually served as a senator for Ohio for 2.5 decades. Although his first run had been derailed when he accidentally slipped in the bathroom the month after he placed in his chip to run in for the US Senate. He slipped and hit his head on the bathtub. Ouch. This left him suffering a concussion, and an inner ear injury had resulted him in restraining from advancing in his campaign. He quit the senator to race as he felt that it would be unfair and not fair to ask for the people of Ohio to simply vote for a name on a piece of paper. The accident delayed Glenn's political career by an entire decade, and it wasn't until 1974 did he finally win the seat in the Senate. Another assassination in the washroom seems to be pretty inevitable in ancient times and medieval eras, like the assassination of King Edmund Ironside. For him, he was just the son of Ethelred the Unready, and just like his dad, he was unready for a lot of things. Considering he only ruled for over half a year in 1016 during the Danish invasion, he earned the title Ironside because of his bravery, valor, and he showcased while fighting against superior invading forces. But he didn't fall in battle like the way people hoped he did. In fact, he was betrayed, in both literal and figurative accounts. According to historians, he was slain in his private bathroom when he needed to take a 20-minute break and had no idea that the enemy's son named Edric snuck into the castle, and he himself had hid in the pit of the toilet, meaning while he was on the toilet, when the king sat down, and when he sat down, he pulled out a Vlad the Impaler moment and stabbed the King Edmund upward multiple times. Surprisingly though, the enemy's father, who was leading the Danish invasion, really respected the King Edmund and was really pissed off that his son did something so dirty, literally, and not honorable. And so he ordered to decap his own kid and placed his head on the highest battlement of the Tower of London. I mean, to be fair, you don't just jump a man when he's on the toilet. That's not cool, especially if he's sitting down and that's where you get him. That's not hood code at all. I mean, aside the toilet, we also go to the bathtub when it comes to inspiration, right? When you're just chilling in there. Of course, not everyone got the bad end of the stick of the bathroom hell, but some actually got good inspirations too. Like the French poet Edmond Rostand did a lot of his writing while soaking in the tub. Most of his famous plays, known as Carnot de Bergerac, sorry French people, as political writers. Carnot was an author of a violent pamphlet against the men of Fronde, which is what he defended Mazarin in a name of political realism as an exemplified of the tradition of Machiavelli. Cyrano's letters showed him as a master of Baroque prose and marked by bold and original metaphors. Rostand regarded working out in the bathroom as a perfect solution of his two problems. He hated being interrupted while he was writing, but at the same time, he loathed to use this as an excuse to turn away from his friends. However, if he was in the bathtub, nobody would, take offense and ask to return another time. So he would focus on his work without worrying of any interruptions. Although he was just a young adolescent during his rule, and it was a very short rule, it was riddled with controversy and scandals. The issue with Elgabalus was that he was just a teenager, meaning the hormones were aggressive and that they didn't have health ed classes in the Roman Empire, and despite being the head priest of a temple, he was also married to 4 women, including a Vestal virgin and also male courtiers. He also been an adult worker himself. I guess times were hard in Rome, where he just really wanted to fulfill a fantasy. But he was promiscuous, and the biggest issue in the Roman Senate, honestly, that seemed to be a big problem, as emperors who would cheat or act up in their intimacy, but this one was just too much. Like, he had no restraint and he needed to chill for a day. But he couldn't, and he was actually addicted, and that was a problem. He also attempted to replace Jupiter with the sun god Egabal, the Rome's chief deity, forced high-ranking Romans to participate in his religious ceremonies, which, of course, as a result of his reputation, was left with promiscuity, and his eccentric zealot behavior is what led to his demise at the age of 18. He was assassinated by not only his cousin Severus Alexander, but it was planned by his own grandmother, the very woman who pushed him to be in power in the first place. They had enough of Elgabalus, and asking them to assassinate Alexander was the final straw. They attacked the Roman emperor, who tried to hide in a latrine, in vain, and his mother was also killed in the process. And afterwards, they had, quote, their heads were cut off and their bodies were being stripped naked and were first dragged all over the city. And then the mother's body was cast along the same. His body himself, after he had this incident in the latrine, was thrown into the river. The reign of King Haakon VII defined Norway first during the first half of the 20th century, with him ruling over 50 years between 1905 to 1957. He is now remembered as one of the country's greatest leaders, although he did have a humiliating end thanks to an accident in the bathroom that marked him to the end of his reign. King Haakon sustained his very bad fall in 1955, and shortly after his 83rd birthday, it didn't kill him, but it did left him confined in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And he survived for 2 more years after that, but then he turned into a shell of his former self, and despite being an octogenarian, Haakon had previously maintained an active lifestyle, maintaining as a skier. Now he was forced to give up the things he loved while he reduced mobility to ensure that his health continuously deteriorated. Haakon became a recluse with a little interest in state affairs or social occasions, and so his son, the Crown Prince Olaf, took off most of the ceremonial duties until his father had passed away and he became the new king. Next is another assassination. Yes, I know. But this one, I actually think anyone would be interested in seeing this as a film or a tension type book in general. Is a lot more interesting, in my opinion, in regards to the French Revolution. And in France, during the French Revolution, multiple groups began to spring up as political influences or ideologies on the government on the land. Some were more liberal, some were more Puritan-based. Some were extreme and others were very passive. But these two parties in particular had heavy beef. The Jacobin and the Girondins. The moment the Jacobins and the Girondins stood up against each other during a meeting, tensions grew not just from leadership but even from their own parties. And it resulted in really big bad things like massacres, especially the Girondins at the hands of the Jacobins. But what happened is that it wouldn't take long for the other to fight back. A man named Jean-Paul Marat was a central figure and was about to be the leader of the Jacobins. In fact, he wanted to find as much Girondins as much as possible and get rid of them. And so he was assassinated in the bathtub by a woman named Charlotte Corday. But why did she do it? Well, because Marat, as I mentioned, was taking down information of the Girondins and who was on the run. Charlotte, however, was a Girondin sympathizer and didn't even resist arrest when she was caught and sent to the guillotine. She said, "Take me. I did it." As intense as the two parties were, they were driven by their ideals for their people, especially for their land. So who knows? But dang, another bathroom later. On the 25th of October, he rose as usual at 6 and drank his chocolate, for all his actions were invariably methodic. A quarter after 7, he went into the little closet. His German valet de chambre in waiting heard a noise and running in found the king dead on the floor. Quote, that is the description of how King George II of Great Britain died in 1760 at the venerable age of 76. As reported by his personal physician Frank Nicholas, in the process, George II joined a long and illustrious line of people who died while straining at the bathroom. But besides the obvious consequence of leaving Great Britain without a king, there was also an unexpected benefit. It allowed Nicholas to provide us with the first clear account of an erotic dissection. Nicholas was tasked with opening and embalming King George II, and he observed and described in detail the deadly erotic disease that fell onto the king. Erotic, yeah. Pericardium was found and distended with a quantity of coagulated blood nearly in the pint. The whole heart was so compressed that it prevented any blood contained in the veins from being forced into the arteries before being into the ventricles that were found absolutely void of blood. And in the trunk of the aorta, we found a transverse fissure on its inner sides about 1.5 inches long, which through a lot of blood seemed to recently pass through its external coat and formed an elevated ecchymosis. Following Nicholas's account, the disease began studying by the medical community, and although it would be almost 2 centuries before a surgery would be developed, it was all thanks to his death that this was discovered. So it worked out if he died in the bathroom and they had to check it out. The Louisiana Purchase is a crucial moment in the history of both France and the United States, and as if Lucien Bonaparte had to be believed, his brother Napoleon decided to sell Louisiana while taking a bath. Great. Which is the audacity, according to Lucien's memory. And he and his brother Joseph was against the idea of Louisiana's purchases, as one day in 1803, Napoleon summoned both his siblings at the Tuileries Palace in Paris and so received them while he was bathing. He was definitely not happy with them, and when Joseph indicated that it might be the opposite than Napoleon on the matter, the latter acted like a petulant child by falling back into the tub, splashing his brothers with the bath water, and at that point Lucien told his siblings that if I were not your brother, I would be your enemy. To which Napoleon once said again in response in a bad-tempered way by smashing a snuff box on the floor. I don't know, I guess he did purchase Louisiana. And finally, Eureka. It is the type of word that the more I look at it, the more it doesn't seem like a real word to me. I don't know if you guys have that problem, but I do. Eureka. But that's what this man Archimedes found out when he was displaced in water in the bathroom. Specifically when the king of Syracuse, Herod II, was initiated and wanted a nice golden crown. So he gave a pure gold bar to a goldsmith, but when the goldsmith returned with the crown, it didn't look like a golden crown. So the king actually felt cheated, but to be honest, it wasn't unheard of for dishonest smiths to mix in other metals to reduce the value of items and to keep the remaining gold for themselves. So the king asked Archimedes like, hey man, this guy, I think he's trying to snake me. I don't think this is real gold, like the gold I gave him, the metal crown. So Archimedes responded saying, okay, no problem man, I got you. So the mathematician thought over the problem while he was taking a bubble bath. He noticed that the more he sunk into the tub, the more water spilled out. Then he realized that there was a relationship between the volume of his body and the volume of the water displaced by his body. Archimedes was so jubilant with his discovery that he leaped out of the bath and he started running around the streets naked yelling, Eureka! At least that's what we think. But once he understood this, the actual experiment was easy. If the crown was indeed made of pure gold, then it should have the same volume as the bar of the gold of the same mass. However, if it did contain silver, then it would be less dense. Archimedes proved that the goldsmith did and indeed tried to cheat the king. And so the goldsmith also ended up being a little less dense after what the king did to him for trying to trick him. So whether or not if this was an accurate tale of Eureka, it was definitely something that was very fascinating in the face of history.
Number 10. The woman who ate her hair. Why did she do this? What happened? Also, how much hair? I have all the questions. This story was featured in the Liverpool Daily Post back in 1869. Yeah, that's how crazy this was. Passerbyers had to read about it in the morning. In the Victorian era, when a 30-year-old passed away in a small village, Normally, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary. Back then, the average life expectancy was 42 years old for women. But when a 30-year-old woman passed away in a small town, the case was odd. Something wasn't right. When doctors conducted an examination of the body, they found a solid 2-pound chunk of hair sitting right there in her stomach. I'm gonna throw up reading this. That was the cause of her death, a massive glob of hair that she ate. What? The woman's sister did note afterwards, after the fact when it was too late, that over the last dozen years, her sister, the victim, had been casually just eating her own hair. Why? Who knows? But don't let your friends or family eat their own hair, okay? Got it? Great, let's move on before I throw up. Number 9, cat craze. I'm 100% a dog guy. Cats are cool, they're independent, they're, doing their own thing. But this next story here really freaks me out, never going back. Back in 1870, a rich woman had put her time, energy, and resources into cat breeding. She had tons of cats, she loved them all, and you know what? They loved her back. It was a good system. Now, it was the 1800s, so there were a lot of candles around at the time. Plus, with everything being extremely flammable, disaster was waiting. It just had to happen. So one night, a fire broke out at this young woman's home and the cats were trapped in the house. They made it out alive, okay? Don't get upset here. But by the time the two maids had kicked the doors open to rescue all the cats, well, they had gone full primal. The fire in the house obviously scared them, so when the doors opened, these two maids were both attacked by the woman's cats. All of the cats, they all attacked them. They thought they were responsible for the fire. I was like, what? I just saved your life. How could you do this? Yeah, what a horrible thank you for saving them. Are you a cat person or a dog person? Comment down below if this story changed you. Number 8, your skin can breathe? During the Victorian era, there was a widespread belief among scientists, believe it or not, that human skin could breathe, similar to how lungs inhale and exhale. That's terrifying to think of, okay? This theory was based on the idea that the skin had pores that allowed oxygen to be absorbed and carbon dioxide to be expelled from the skin. Literally just breathing skin, that's disgusting, that's horrible, it's a nightmare. As a result, some people would wear looser clothing and avoid tight corsets to allow their skin to literally breathe more easily. However, this belief was eventually debunked, obviously, as it became clear that the skin did not actually function like a set of lungs. Why, of course not, yeah. Nonetheless, the idea of skin breathing persisted in popular culture and language for many years. People were like, no, I'm still believing that my wrist is breathing right now. I can hear it. I'm gonna believe that for 100 years. Number 7, the Brooklyn theater tragedy. Before YouTube, I was doing plays in high school. I loved theater. I also loved watching any sort of theater, comedy, anything, you name it. Thing is, I get too distracted while I'm watching, right? When I watch theater now, I can't help but look for all the emergency exits, okay? That's the first thing I do, and it's because of historical events like this next one here. Before emergency exits and every safety regulation, theater in the Victorian era was extremely dangerous. In 1876, for example, the Brooklyn Theater caught fire during a performance. One of the actors was getting too into it and he accidentally kicked over a lantern that was on stage. Reminder, this was 1876, everybody was dressed to the nines, wearing their finest flammable attire, no capacity in the theater, no fire marshal, no chance of survival. The fire spread quickly and in the end, 278 people lost their lives. A monument was put up after the incident took place. They're like, hey, remember that? That was scary, huh? All right, let's not change anything for 100 years. Got it. Number 6, bathroom blowout. One of the greatest Victorian inventions was the bathroom. I literally just used it. Good times, all around success in there. It's the room where you go and you sit, you do your business, and you go on your phone for 46 minutes. But it took a few tries to figure out these toilet troubles, dare I say. Flammable gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide, they build up over time with human waste, which then builds up in the sewers and eventually backs up into our homes. So methane gas building up over time equals spontaneous combustion. Next thing you know, you're lighting a candle in your bathroom and you, gone, just like that, in the blink of an eye. Now we have poo-pourri, you know, a little spray that hides what you've done, hides all your mess that you did previously. Fascinating how far we've come, isn't it? The bathroom, crazy, 100 years. Number 5. Quick divorce. Let's just say the love wasn't working out, okay? It happens, people change, right? You go that way, I'll go this way. Now what? Say it's the Victorian era and divorce in England isn't allowed until 1857. Now what? What are we gonna do? Well, considering what list we're on and how I'm talking about it, well, it's pretty horrible and unfair. You were getting sold. That's what happens. How horrible is that? There's wife sellers out there. That was their full-time job. It was a legitimate business too. There were auctions, public auctions would be done, and you would watch people bid on marrying your wife. What a time that was. One real sale that happened in 1862 was in Selby, and the asking price was 1 beer. Yeah, 1 pint, sold just like that. I'll trade you for my wife. What? Other times, and most of the time, thankfully, it was a rather expensive exchange. God, I hope that beer was at least an IPA or something. Like a Guinness, you know, like it was kind of worth it, not like a light beer. That's crazy, can't believe that. Number 4, Burke and Hare. Medical schools were offering a handsome fee for deceased bodies to study. So, at this point in the Victorian era, there was an unhealthy amount of Victorians that came up with a new solution, if you want to call it that. Grave robbing. Yep, it got so out of hand that family members were actually on guard, guarding the graves of recently deceased. Yeah, dudes were jumping out of the bushes trying to steal your gam-gam. Like an hour after she died. How horrible is that? Get out of here. It's stupid. Nobody was as evil as William Burke and William Hare. See, they stood out historically during this time because, well, they wouldn't wait until the body was done living, if you catch my drift. Yeah, they would do it. They were impatient, to say the least, and sadly it took 16 victims in total before people started to catch on. The Anatomy Act of 1832 put an end to all this horrific ideas. So gross. Also, grave robbing is like it's horrible, right? But it's kind of funny. Number 3, the eruption of Krakatoa. 1883, the volcanic eruption of Krakatoa in Indonesia was one of the most violent in recorded history. It caused a massive death toll in the surrounding areas and affected global climate and weather patterns. That's how big this was. That's crazy. The loud boom of the initial eruption was heard thousands of miles away, and the ash affected sunsets around the world for years. Yeah, not just a week, years. This was a dark period, literally. This is something you hear about that happens thousands of years ago, but you never guess that an eruption of this magnitude happened so recently. That's why I'm here. There you go, you're welcome. Hit that thumbs up for scary knowledge. Number 2, arsenic dresses. If looks could kill, let's talk about it. The vivid green dyes used in some, well, a lot of Victorian clothing were created using arsenic, which was known for its potent toxicity. It's very, don't put it in your mouth or eyes, ever. Awesome. It's really the last thing you want to put on your body in general. The color, also referred to as Paris green, was used in wallpapers, paints, and fabrics. It was all over the place. It was in your walls, like you were literally just breathing it in. This green back here, this green screen, let's hope that it's not Paris green. I'll ask some questions after. Those who wore the dresses or worked with the dye could suffer from symptoms of arsenic poisoning, including sores, respiratory issues, and even death. Most of the time, death. Despite awarenesses of the dangers, the brilliant hue kept the dresses in demand until safer dyes became available. Yeah, half the crowd didn't even care. They're like, oh, but green's my color. It makes my eyes pop. What am I supposed to do? Wear all black? Gotta be different. And finally, number 1. Grim accessories. The Victorian era's fascination with death, it was driven by the high mortality rates and the mourning, of course, of Queen Victoria, hence the era named after her. Now, these major historical events were staples that influenced fashion in various weird ways. Grim accessories often featured gothic elements, including skulls, bones, or other symbols of death. Yeah, you just rock up to work one day with just a femur across your chest. You're like, hey, what do you think? Not bad, right? It's hand-me-down. It's a heirloom. At the same time, mourning jewelry was also a hot new trend. Yeah, to mourn somebody via jewelry. And by jewelry, I mean lockets of their hair. Lockets of real, human, disgusting hair, just popping out of it at all times. I'm gonna throw up. Hair, being both personal and non-decomposing, was seen as the perfect memento. I'm gonna throw up, this is so gross to me. Just a thing of hair on your neck. The trend was popularized by Queen Victoria herself, who wore mourning jewelry after the death of her husband, Prince Albert. So, question before we close her off, would you ever wear the hair of a loved one that has recently passed? And also, why not? Why would you never do that? Comment down below. Curious if I'm the only one that finds this haunting.